This second segment of Module 3 will focus on racism as manifested through structural discrimination and health outcomes. And we'll pick up here in this segment and the future segments where we left off in the previous segment, focusing on different forms of discrimination as an interpretation of racial disparities in health. So in essence, how racial discrimination in multiple different forms can explain the observed patterning in health by race. So just to start off with a few definitions, these terms are often used interchangeably, but if we differentiate them, we would characterize racism in the sort of broadest way as the beliefs, attitudes, and institutional arrangements and acts that tend to denigrate individuals or groups because of phenotypic characteristics or ethnic group affiliation. Prejudice is a little bit more narrow, focusing on the negative or stigmatizing beliefs about a group. And finally, discrimination embodying practices or acts ranging from social distancing to overt aggression. To discuss different types of racism and specifically discrimination and health, we're going to build right on Camara Jones' typology of racism or discrimination. Her article in your recommended readings really describes three types or groups of discriminatory practices or systems. The first is structural, referring to differential access to resources, it's normative, sometimes legalized or not, where there is not necessarily an identifiable perpetrator, but can manifest in a multitude of ways that are sort of systemic, institutional in nature, embedded in structures, and can manifest as overt acts of disadvantage or often also as inaction in the face of need. I think the federal government's response to Katrina was a perfect example of a process of inaction that can be characterized as reflecting structural discrimination and racism. At the interpersonal level, we're talking about forms of prejudice and discrimination that manifest as intentional or unintentional acts in an interpersonal context. They can again be acts of commission or omission that reflect a lack of respect, ways of interacting that are dehumanizing, convey suspicion, engagement in scapegoating, etc. A whole range of practices that play out in interpersonal dynamics. And then the third is internalized, which, according to Camara Jones, reflects the acceptance and internalization of negative stereotypes and concepts of self-worth by members of a stigmatized group. All of these types of racism or discrimination reflect and perpetrate societal norms and ideologies, whether or not they are explicit or more insidious. And if we start with the first, we can see how structural racism leads to major health disparities in health through disparities in health-related resources. So an example of a manifestation of structural or institutional racism would be education disparities. Here you can see for all racial ethnic groups, here are whites and here are blacks. There are real significant disparities, not only between whites and blacks, but between whites, blacks, and other groups in the level of educational attainment achieved. So the lowest attainment here is for blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans, and then getting much higher for whites and Asians. And that is true at every level of educational attainment. You also see this in employment, where you have, over time, really persistent disparities in employment levels between blacks and whites. Also, median household net worth, again, really persistent differentials over time. This, of course, reflecting wealth, something we've talked about before as being often extremely divergent by race. That you have even starker, more significant disparities in wealth by race than you do by income, but also that you can really see the extent to which these are sizable and persistent over time. Also see racial ethnic disparities in access to health insurance. Here, just two different ways of conveying this. You have, again, huge differentials, large deficits in access to health insurance among Latinos, as well as African Americans relative to non-Latino whites. And in here, the risk of being uninsured is very, very divergent by race and ethnicity. One of the major manifestations of structural discrimination is in the incarceration, in the criminal justice system in the United States. And I'll elaborate on this at length with just some ways of characterizing the nature of race and incarceration in the U.S. and refer you to other resources where this problem is much more elucidated than what we'll have time for here. But in essence, a couple of ways of characterizing race and incarceration in the U.S. African Americans are only about 13% of the U.S. population, only about 15% of people known to engage in drug use in the U.S., and yet over 35% of those arrested for drug offenses, almost 50% of the American adult population in federal or state jails and prisons, and over 40% of prisoners on death row. So even if you just look at the contrast between the proportion of the U.S. population and the percentage of the population on death row, you see that there is a tremendous overrepresentation of the African American population in the criminal justice system, even in its most dire form. Here are some comparisons across race and incarceration rates. Whites, Latinos, and blacks. This is the population overall, and you see huge differentials. If you desegregate by sex, you see even greater differentials. Here, the burden of the racialized incarceration system in the U.S. being borne disproportionately by males, even more so by young males. Here, we've just limited the population to men aged 25 to 29. And if you put the incarceration situation in contrast internationally, you can see these really stark contrasts here. This is a black adult men under South Africa, or incarcerated under South Africa during apartheid, and in the U.S. under Bush. So you can see that this is really shockingly differential in terms of incarceration rates. A book published recently called Invisible Men, Mass Incarceration and the Myth of Black Progress, highlighted how much race differentials in incarceration actually have skewed our perception of the status of the African American population in the U.S. in the following way. She observes that among high school dropouts born between 1975 and 79, 68% of blacks, compared with 28% of whites, have been imprisoned at some point by 2009, and 37% of blacks, compared with 12% of whites, were incarcerated that year. By the time they turn 18, 1 in 4 black children will have experienced the imprisonment of a parent, and more young black dropouts are in prison or jail than have paying jobs, and black men are more likely to go to prison than to graduate with a 4-year college degree or complete military service. And finally, black dropouts are more likely to spend at least a year in prison than to get married. And as a result of the mass incarceration of the African American male population in the U.S., what she argues is that this generates a myth of black progress when we assess black progress in the non-institutionalized population, leading to an overestimate of black progress in education and employment, wages, and voting participation, because these estimates of black progress in these metrics are captured through population level surveys that do not take into account the incarcerated population. Now, to look at incarceration of the black population in the U.S. on this scale and interpret it as a manifestation of structural racism and discrimination rather than to increases in deviant behavior of individuals within the black population, one needs to understand it in social context, in historical context. And in the book Mass Incarceration by Ernie Drucker that was recommended on the syllabus, he really tracks that history in the social context of incarceration of the black population over time, and I recommend it. But just to give you some of the key features of what's often described as the U.S. prison industrial complex. One key feature is the recency of the U.S. prison boom. Incarceration rates were stable until the 70s and then doubled in the 80s and again in the 90s. And this is in the context of, over that time period, a decrease in incarceration of violent offenders, but a dramatic increase in incarceration of people jailed for non-violent crimes. And these patterns and many others, and the extent to which these patterns are highly, highly racialized, has led many critics and observers to the observation that in the U.S., incarceration is being used as a solution to social ills of many kinds, and also as a source of industry and financial gain through the extensive privatization of the prison industry in the United States, to the extent that there is a real profit generation process here through incarceration of individuals, leading to all sorts of distortions in public policy, like influences on sentencing laws that increase incarcerations and jail sentences for individuals convicted of relatively minor crimes. So again, this kind of points to an historical, social process full of agents pursuing various agendas that produce this overwhelmingly racialized picture, an outcome of the incarcerated population in the U.S. Now, the long-term consequences of contact with the criminal justice system are rather intuitive in terms of subsequent outcomes, but they too are highly racialized and reflect a very insidious form of racial discrimination, and in that they are not evenly experienced. So one of the challenges with studying the consequences of structural forms of discrimination is that it's very hard to identify those experiences as experiences of individuals and then tie those experiences to subsequent outcomes in ways that really allow for strong causal inference. One of the reasons that's problematic is that people often are not aware of their experience of racial discrimination at a structural level. One of the ways that the effects of structural discrimination have been captured is through audit studies. And the Pager article in your recommended list is a really elegant illustration of the power of an audit study. This is an employment audit study with mock applicants, and they were randomly assigned, the black and white participants were randomly assigned to have either a record, a nonviolent felony drug conviction on their record or no criminal record, and then sent out to seek jobs. The education and work experience on both black and white applicants, mock applicants, were made to appear equal in all pairs. And the jobs were all low entry-level positions requiring no previous experience and no education beyond high school. And what she found in this study was the percentages of people called back for jobs after the first contact for an employment application were that the whites with a criminal record were much more likely to get called back than blacks with a criminal record. But they were even more likely to get called back than blacks without a criminal record. And that distinction you see here is in the 17% of whites with a criminal record compared to 14% of blacks without a criminal record. And as Pager concludes, the criminal justice system, as pervasive as it is, becomes a dominant presence in the lives of young disadvantaged men, playing a key role in sorting and stratifying labor market opportunities for them subsequently. Another mechanism of structural discrimination is in the realm of housing policies and practices. SERI refers to discriminatory practices among real estate agents against potential buyers or renters who are directed to live in particular areas and to avoid others. Redlining traditionally refers to the refusal of a bank to lend money to finance a house in black neighborhoods. It continues today in different forms than when banks actually circled neighborhoods in red where they would not lend to people of particular racial ethnic backgrounds. The current manifestations of this include stark lending disparities between black and white neighborhoods of comparable income and between black and white applicants, even if they have, again, comparable income level. Here is a map from another audit test, this one looking at paired testing for steering in the Detroit metro area. Green dots are white testers and in white areas, as designated by the white colored background, and black testers are in yellow dots. And you can see that blacks are shown more properties in red areas, which are the higher proportion black tracts. Here is evidence of redlining, the percentage of mortgages denied by banks according to the borrower's race, ethnicity, controlling for income. So you see here disparities at the upper end for blacks and American Indians relative to whites, also higher for Hispanics relative to other groups. Here you have percentage of applicants denied for a home loan by race, ethnicity, and also broken down by income. So you can see that blacks are most likely to be rejected for a home loan at every income level here, including the upper income level. So this is, again, a group that is all comparable in terms of income, and you can see these really dramatic racial ethnic disparities in terms of who's more likely to be rejected for a mortgage. And as a result of these discriminatory practices and sort of other structural obstacles, there's a pervasive amount of racial residential segregation in the U.S. And this is one of the most pervasive manifestations of structural discrimination that we can observe today, which has really important implications for access to material resources that are relevant for health. Residential segregation is also one of the indicators of discriminatory processes that is most studied in the field of health disparities, because compared to others, it's an exposure that is relatively easy to measure compared to other forms of structural racism. Dissimilarity is the most commonly used measure of racial residential segregation. It measures how separate two groups are from each other in a given metropolitan area, and it's also what's referred to as a measure of evenness. The way you interpret this is that here, for example, looking at the racial dissimilarity in 2000, what this means is that 65% of black, or in this case white Americans, would have to relocate to a different neighborhood or census tract in their metropolitan area for blacks and whites to be perfectly racially integrated. In general, this dotted line here indicates dissimilarity level of 60. A score of 60 is considered high. And even though racial segregation has come down for blacks over time slightly, it's still very high. It's also very high for Hispanics. So the literature that has looked at racial residential segregation in health identifies segregation as a fundamental cause of racial health disparities. And the hypothesized and studied pathways between racial residential segregation and health include things like education and employment differentials that lead to differential SES and block social mobility, and then of course have health consequences. Another hypothesized process mechanism is disinvestments in communities that are highly racially segregated, which then of course has implications for neighborhood resources, services, and health. Also different kind of just noxious elements or exposures in a particular neighborhood because of social disadvantage that can be both social and physical. Social things like crime even, and physical could be things like noxious exposures in the community that could be limited to asthma and so forth. And also it has important implications for the socio-demographic composition, obviously, of a given neighborhood, which may then create differential implications for social contact, interaction, and so forth, which may, importantly, not always be negative for health. There is some evidence that ethnic enclaves, for example, which could be characterized as one very specific form of racial ethnic residential segregation, are in some instances good for health or protective for immigrant populations. Studies looking at racial segregation among African Americans and health outcomes have found patterns in outcomes in the expected direction that look at things like all-cause and cause-specific mortality, infant mortality, tuberculosis, and others. A few other forms of structural discrimination that are worth mentioning, things that are really hard to capture in population health studies, but are some of the upstream social processes that we can think about when we try to identify some of the upstream drivers of the racial disparities that we observe in health studies. Things like the effects of the deindustrialization on work options that are very racialized, the effects of post-war interstate highway system on cities, living conditions, schools, jobs, basic geographies and behavioral risk factors, something I'll elaborate on momentarily, and something that's, of course, been in the news somewhat recently with the most recent presidential election is voter ID laws, as a perfect example of something that is not designed well, that's arguable. On the face of it, applies to everybody, but in practice has very different implications for racial ethnic groups. And as such, if you think about consequences independent of the intentionality, acknowledged or not, in the voter ID laws that, for example, require people to have certain kinds of ID in order to be able to vote, as being very racialized in their impact in terms of affecting who gets to vote. This is not something that is at all likely to have uniform impact across racial ethnic groups. So more on the geography of behavioral risk factors. Here's an example of a study by Kuwate et al. Looking at targeted advertising in New York City environments. So you're looking at the prevalence of alcohol ads and seeing the non-random distribution of some of alcohol advertising that is coinciding with areas that are heavily concentrated in African American communities. Also targeted fast food marketing. Here you have the contrast between Kentucky Fried Chicken is the green dots and the white dots are Starbucks, and you can see there's a very non-random distribution in the location of these fast food outlets. Interesting to call Starbucks a fast food outlet. So again, thinking about structural discrimination or institutional racism and health, compared to other forms of racism, this one is relatively understudied. Again, by virtue of the constraints on how we measure this and link exposures to institutional racism to individuals so that we can tie them to their health outcomes. Most work has been population-based studies has been ecological or multi-level. Much of it has used indices of racial segregation, physical residential segregation, or used things like racial ethnic composition as a way of approximating processes of segregation at a structural level. But again, these become rather imprecise and don't allow for very rigorous causal inference arguments because of the risk of selection factors really operating there in terms of residence and location and being potentially relevant for health outcomes. One area where there has also been some attention to processes of institutional racism as they affect health, though, has been in health outcomes, healthcare outcomes. And what has been documented quite extensively is different processes by which there could be racial differences in access to and quality of healthcare. One is differential access, a function of socioeconomic status. So racial groups have different access to social resources, and those economic social resources translate into different access to healthcare. But also there's been a fair degree of attention to how there may be racial differences in quality and outcomes as a function of discrimination. And one report that I think has done a really good job in documenting this quite extensively has been an Institutes of Medicine report that was congressionally mandated called Unequal Treatment, that focused on disparities in healthcare that were not due to access-related factors or clinical need. So again, sort of holding constant issues around socioeconomic status that might be important drivers of getting care, different quality of care, the different speed of access to care, and so forth. And really focusing on the operation of healthcare systems once people get into them. And focusing very specifically on the possibility of mechanisms related to discrimination in the form of biases, stereotyping, and also ambiguity in clinical communications and in decision making. And what this report documented was that after you account for really important access issues, insurance, income, things that are going to be related to severity of symptoms, the presentation of individuals when they receive health care, things related to age, comorbidity, symptom expression, severity. When you account for all of these factors, African Americans are less likely to, this is just a sample of the findings, receive appropriate cardiac medication, undergo coronary artery bypass surgery, receive dialysis and kidney transplantation, receive high-quality basic clinical services, and receive antiretroviral drugs, with very important, obvious, and very direct consequences for survival. And if you're really interested in a further explication of the multiple ways in which discriminatory racist processes are operating within one system, one institution, the healthcare system, I really recommend that you check out this report, because it's quite comprehensive, I think, and did a very good job of documenting these processes in very compelling ways.